welcome to another edition of The Pedalshift Project. The Pedalshift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments around the bike touring lifestyle. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride, let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/144, and you can email the show pedalshift@pedalshift.net or call the voicemail hotline 202-930-1109 and check Pedalshift out on all the socials as well. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 144th edition of the Pedalshift Project. I am Tim Mooney, and I am so happy to be here today. This will be the final edition, the lessons from the abbreviated Great Allegheny Passage tour by Brompton. But before we dive into all of that, I thought I would give you a little bit of a roadmap for, well, kind of the next few weeks of the Pedalshift Project as we close out 2018. It's hard to believe that the year is almost over. It just sort of flew right by as far as I'm concerned. Next week is our best of show. It's a good one too, so stay tuned for that. That'll be the first week of December. Following that, Pedalshift Live is returning for the month of December. It will be held, write this down on your calendars, kids, Friday, December 7th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, it's going to be sort of the holiday party pod put out the following week if you can't make it, but you should come. It's pedalshift.net/live, a lot of fun. And topic to be announced. It'll probably come out in the newsletter as well, the December newsletter, and it will also, of course, be at pedalshift.net/live. So Friday, December 7th. 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Hope to see you all there. These have been a lot of fun. Speaking of, if you did end up missing out, we did have kind of another quasi-live event this past week, as you may have known. It is the Tour Journals Volume 12 brand new video over at YouTube. And as I mentioned, it was a sort of hastily organized live premiere last week that I did as an experiment. You can do this new thing with YouTube now where you can have the video kind of come out and you can premiere it and be in a chat box and kind of have a live event. And there were a smattering of folks in there, and thank you all for who did end up showing up for it. It was a lot of fun. I learned a few things, most of which is you can't just have the chat box go on forever after the video airs. So after 15 minutes or so, I think it was maybe even 10 minutes, everybody got cut off. So lesson learned, promo ahead of time. Hi. And then the second thing that I have to understand is that most of the chatter has to happen before the video is actually premiered. Good to know. Good to know. We'll do that again probably for, well, it's probably not going to be until the winter or spring, the next bike tour, whenever I do another kind of big video rollout. I've been enjoying doing these. I think that they've been well received enough that I'll keep doing them. So look for them in 2019. By the way, speaking of the topic of that video, here's the takeaway episode for the Great Allegheny Passage tour by Brompton. Let's start with the general takeaways from the trip. Calling a tour before you want to is not fun, but I've learned through the years that it's also not failure. I've called trips on both the Great Allegheny Passage and the C&O on a bunch of different occasions. And I think part of it is because a lot of the times I don't have necessarily a full-fledged figured out ending to the tour. Obviously biking all the way back home is always an option. But often I find myself going, no, I've had enough, or the conditions are such that I've done all the biking that I can, or anything along those lines. And that was certainly true on this tour as well. Now, I've been talking about this tour for what feels like months now, and I think that my plans were constantly shifting and changing. You may recall that I talked about it, being a thing where I would do both trails, take the Brompton from Pittsburgh all the way back to DC. And of course, that wasn't in the cards on a variety of different levels. And of course, the conditions ended up making it so that I basically only did one actual day of bicycling. There was a lot of travel on either end of it, so that kind of added on to the adventure of the whole thing. But, overall, it was still a fun trip, and I don't consider it a failed trip just because I didn't cycle for multiple days in a row. I think that there were a lot of elements to the use of the Brompton and how I went about it, and the cheap bus ticket, and all those different types of things that really made this kind of a cool trip. Second big takeaway is you can prep for everything and still not be ready. I think that was particularly true here. I had all the cold weather gear that I needed. I had wet weather gear that I needed, and I'd used it before. I mentioned, I think on the last episode, that turned out my wet weather gear, I probably should have done a little bit more of a once-over on it. The gloves weren't going to work out too well for me, at least my wet weather ones. The pants maybe weren't as waterproof. I probably should have done another bit of treatment on them. But generally speaking, I had everything that I needed. I could have pushed through, but I just didn't really want to. I just wasn't maybe mentally ready, or, I just changed my mind as to what I wanted to put up with. So I had everything prepared. I just, in the end, wasn't ready for what was being thrown at me. The other element was the weather ended up being about as bad as it could have been. I mean, when you start having rain close to freezing, but not snow, I think that's the hardest thing to bike in personally. It's my least comfortable weather to be in. So I think that was an element to all of it. I had the gear, just wasn't ready. Next thing up in the general takeaways, transitioning between heat and cold is jarring. I think it's easier to handle cold when you've been exposed to it for a while. And this has just been a weird year for me. I've been exposed to a ton of heat this year, and we went from hot to cold with very little transition in between. So I'm finding that I'm a lot colder than I usually am. I can put up with cold a lot easier, but this year, I don't know, maybe I'm an old guy. Maybe I'm turning into that old dude who wears cardigan sweaters around the house and stuff. I don't know. I just think that I wasn't ready for the cold as much either. And maybe later in the winter, I'll be all transitioned up for it. Because as I look back to the Washington trip, where I'd been through an entire winter of really frigid cold air, those same conditions didn't really bother me as much. So that might be another element for takeaway here as well. I mentioned this before, but next takeaway is inspect your gear. I had two critical issues with my wet and cold gear, and I already talked about that a little bit earlier here. It's something that I sometimes make assumptions about the state of my gear, and that's a bad thing to do. I do have good, reliable gear, but it is a really good idea to take a look at it. I rarely take a look at my panniers or my dry bags to inspect to see if I've got holes in them. That's another thing that could have been problematic. Now, it turns out I have subsequently looked at all of my gear, so I know what state it's in. But I think it's incredibly important to look at your gear before you go on tour. And that was a mistake that I made that I will definitely not make again. I may have even done a podcast, and you all can tell me. I think I've done a podcast that says, here are the critical things you do before you go on a tour, and one of them is inspect your gear, and I didn't do it, so mea culpa. You should do that. Check your gear. It's important. Next takeaway, know your bailout points in advance. If you're hit with a deadline, say there's a train coming in an hour, hypothetically, you have a better idea on what your choices are when you need to make a snap decision. So this was the case for me in Connellsville. I woke up in the morning and I realized that it was not something, the tour was not something I wanted to continue. So it was sort of like, okay, I could have sat there on my phone learning about all of the different options, knowing that there's only one train back from Connellsville per day, and that the next train stop is actually quite a bit further down. It was Cumberland, or turning around and going to Pittsburgh. But I knew all of those things in advance. So the question only was going to be, hey, what time does the train come this morning? I knew it was in the morning. And I thought, oh, well, I know that the train comes relatively soon as I was lying there. And it turned out that the train was delayed by enough time that kind of helped me make my decision, because it sort of said, you know what, you're not feeling it. You could stay and take a 0 day and decide tomorrow, or, if you're really not feeling it, just, grab the train now. And that ended up working out. I think that bailout points are important mile markers for you in any kind of a tour, because not that you're necessarily thinking about bailing out of something early, but then you just have the ability to make decisions in a little bit more fluid response way. And I found that to be really, really important on this tour, because frankly, it sort of made the whole thing end up working out for me a little bit better, just in terms of my transition coming home. It just ended up working out a lot better. So that was good. Or in a sense, you can go with the flow. As I mentioned, could have done a 0-mile day. I could have tried biking and either push through or turn back. Ultimately, I'm happy with my choice. When I woke up on a Sunday morning and I was warm and I was dry and I saw that it was 26 degrees Fahrenheit in Cumberland. And just imagining the awfulness of getting out of my sleeping bag that morning. I've done, in fact, this year I've done the sort of, hey, let's punish ourselves a little bit kind of a tour. And ultimately, I just chose against that this time. Maybe I'll do it again. I'm sure I will. For this trip, I think that what I was willing to put myself through for the final tour of the year, it ended up not being something that I really wanted to put myself through. And, that's also, it's interesting, just as kind of a sidebar here on the general takeaways. I also realized that it had an impact on how things were going to go for talking to you all about it. When I commit to doing a tour, I'm also thinking, all right, I'm bringing everybody along on a ride. And so to a certain extent, I didn't want to disappoint you all through this whole process. And trust me, as I was in the tent that morning, that was a consideration, believe it or not. Not that I think that the show should kind of dictate how my bike tours go, but it's something like, oh shoot, I was really looking forward to having this great, awesome long tour to share with everybody, for several weeks, maybe even into December a little bit, but it wasn't to be. And you know what? I know that there's other tours, and I also learned a lot on this, and we're going to talk a little bit more about them for what I'm going to probably do next year, because honestly, I really do think I'm going to try to do this tour again with the Brompton, starting on the Gap and coming back, or maybe going from DC to Pittsburgh. I don't know. I haven't figured that out yet, but I think there was enough that I got out of this that there are good lessons for all of this, just from a general perspective. All right. So those are the general takeaways. Let's talk about the Brompton specific takeaways. Now, as you all know, I was on my favorite little clown bike, the Brompton, and it was frankly pretty interesting how well it handled the cycling on the Gap. I'm not sure that I'm going to do the backpack method again for hauling my gear unless there's a need for having a backpack. So, for instance, if I'm going to be on a tour where I think, oh, maybe I'll do some hiking, or for some reason my transportation, it's a lot easier to have everything in the backpack. You should take a look, if you haven't by now, the updated Brompton setup video. That was a separate video. I shot it actually in front of the Washington Monument. It was actually kind of cool. And you can kind of see how it set up a little bit more specifically. You can see it on the new video as well when I was kind of out in the field, but I didn't really kind of highlight how everything was all set up. But I will say it was, I think, a lighter setup. I had everything that I needed, and I was really avoiding the heel strike issues that I had with the backpack. I think one of the best parts about the new setup compared to the backpack setup is my backpack is, and I don't think most backpacks are, waterproof. You need to put some kind of a rain cover on it. And while my rain cover was perfectly great, I have on this setup an exclusively waterproof bag setup. So the Ortlieb pannier on front, the 2 dry bags in the back. So I'm fully waterproof the entire time. That I think is an advantage as well. So, it was as much in terms of gear as my light setup on the larger bike, which is actually kind of amazing when you think about it. That on that teeny tiny little bike, in that teeny tiny little bit of a package, I can carry my full sleep kit, my full tent, and have enough room to have basically everything that I need. It's a really cool kind of setup there. Another takeaway from a Brompton perspective is regarding the gearing. I found on this ride, more so than other rides, is that spinning on lower gears just made my day a little bit better. And you read about this a lot in kind of performance cycling and things like that you should be kind of in a cadence, a high spinning cadence, and that it's kind of better, it's more efficient, etc., etc. I think that's sometimes easier said than done, because I tend to be in I tend to be watching the clock. I tend to be watching the sun. I keep thinking, well, I should be able to bike in this gear because it's flat and blah, blah, blah. I think that I forgave myself a little bit on that and listened more to the kind of performance types out there and found that it was just a lot easier of a day. Yeah, granted, I didn't go as fast, but it was a lot easier and I felt a little bit fresher at the end of the day. You may recall that I was saying from the prior Brompton tour this year in the spring that I was reducing my expectations in terms of mileage on the Brompton. Well, I did a full 62, and I think that the lower spinning, the lower gearing, the spinning, I think made a big difference there. Riding on flats is I go back and forth on it. I think I went back and forth in the middle of the podcast, by the way. You may have noticed this, but I think one time I said, oh, it's all flat, so it'll be easier. And then I said, oh, it's all flat, so I'm constantly spinning. I think I go back and forth on it, but I do think when I first started touring, I considered the fact that I was on a flat for, cycling 6, 7, 8 hours a day was good training until I hit hills. And then I thought, oh my God, I got to hit hills to actually train. And now in later years, I think I found that the hill work is actually a little bit easier because you do give your legs a little bit of a rest when you're doing some coasting. And on the flats, you're just constantly spinning. So you've got to adjust what your expectations are, adjust what your performance level is, and things will be better for you. It's just really interesting. I've been doing this for a while, but I'm constantly learning, and hopefully what I learn and what I talk about, even though it may contradict itself from time to time, might be helpful for you. Tires. Let's talk about the tires. I talked about this prior to the ride, and I would say that the tire width and the tire size, I mean, granted, these are 16-inch tires. They are substantially smaller than what I'm used to. They're also a little bit narrower, as I mentioned on the prior versions of the podcast. I think sort of the intro one on this. But generally speaking, I didn't notice too much of a difference. They were fine on the trail, and they were less fine on wet portions of the trail. And frankly, that's kind of an evergreen statement for tire widths of all sizes. I noticed even on my super wide tires on the Safari that on wet sections of the gap that I got slow and stuck and things like that. It's just how it is. I think that the trail conditions are a little bit more important in my experience than the width of the tire, whether you're riding a 38 millimeter or 35 millimeter as I was doing. So I would say if you're thinking about doing a Brompton and you've got this sort of stock, what do I have? Oh, I have the Schwalbes. You're going to be fine on something like the Katie. You're going to be fine on something like the Gap. Certainly great on pavement. I think that the real open question and something I will need to test is how well does a Brompton do on the C&O? I know that in the muddy parts, it will be not so much fun. On the less muddy parts, I have a funny feeling that it would probably perform pretty well. So that's something I'm looking forward to testing out a little more next season. Hopefully, if the damn trail ever dries up. But that's for another podcast. I think 60 miles is good as a maximum target for the Brompton. So I'm sort of revising what I talked about before, where I was like, maybe I'm more in the 50-mile range. I think 60 is totally fine. I think everything is going to be dependent on conditions. Everything's going to depend on did you do a big long day before, etc. But I think 60 is probably a good max target. Knowing full well that I could probably do more if it was really pushed. But, this is just for sort of planning purposes when it comes to organizing a tour around a Brompton bike. If I was riding my Brompton and I was riding with someone like Mysterious James, which I've done in the past, actually, he was way ahead of me because he was on his Surly Long Haul Trucker. This was a couple of years ago in California around Big Sur. This was the first time I ever rode a tour on this bike. But that's fine. I caught up with him eventually and it was fine. I was just a little bit slower and from time to time on some of those bigger hills had to walk up the hill. But generally speaking, 60 miles, okay. I think it'll be fine. Last but not least, in terms of the Brompton takeaways, specifically for the Brompton takeaways, I think from a security perspective, you have to take into account that the triangle on a Brompton is very small, so it's a little bit difficult to lock up. I know a lot of people find that with their Bromptons, they're like, oh, it's great when you're on tour, you just fold it up and take it in with you. Well, I find that easier said than done. Especially there's a bunch of places where if I brought in the folding bike, they would first they'd be weirded out. Second of all, they may not like it. I've actually had the Brompton in places where I brought it in and they're like, no bikes allowed. And I was like, okay. So I fold it up and, they don't even realize it at that point. But if you've got all of your gear with you, it's hard to kind of keep everything secure and bring it in with you. I guess if you're at a grocery store and you've got a big shopping cart, you could do that. But again, it's not always really great. I was at a pizza place in West Newton, Pennsylvania, and I didn't want to bring the bike inside. There were stairs anyways. So locking it up on their bike rack was a little tricky just because of the geometry of the whole thing. It was a little weird, but I was able to do it. I had a lock that could do it, but it's something to think about when it comes to a Brompton. You're not going to be able to lock it up as easily as another type of bike. You might need to start thinking about bringing a cable as well, and then your security level goes down because cables are more easily defeated, more easily snipped. I had a folding like lock, and that worked just fine. But it was limited too for how it could reach and how its geometry was. So, final takeaway from the security perspective on the Brompton is you've got to realize that you might not be able to lock your bike up exactly how you'd like, where you'd like. And your locking options are a little bit more. I think that if I wasn't able to lock it up, I absolutely would have tried to figure out a way to bring it into that pizza place, or frankly, I might have just looked for another place to eat. That's another thing there too. So that's it for Brompton specific takeaways. Next up are my Great Allegheny Passage takeaways. I always have new ones every time I ride, so here they are for this trip. First one is that off season is so great. It is quiet, it is beautiful, and if you're like me and when you're in these back country kind of rides and you like the solitude more than you like running into people, it's the greatest time to go. I really do like off season, even though the weather isn't quite as good, and obviously that had an impact on me overall. I'm a big fan of off season. So the next takeaway from the Gap is kind of funny because I have been in the past a little bit critical of the quality of the signage on the Pittsburgh side of the trail. It was a little bit dodgy. I think it's really greatly improved now. Now, I don't know if it's because I recognize it a little bit better or if the signage is indeed improved. It's probably a combination of both, but I didn't need to hit Google Maps a single time for a turn or anything like that. I think that that's great because that was the one thing that I thought was a little bit hard when I first did the Great Allegheny Passage from the Pittsburgh side, especially going from Pittsburgh south. It was just a little confusing to me because there's a whole bunch of different trails, and the Great Allegheny Passage is actually an accumulation of a variety of trails that were linked together. And it wasn't super clear early on, for me at least, which direction I needed to go in a couple of instances. I think it's a lot better now, and it's really great and it's helpful, especially when you're going through parts that are sort of like, hey, wait, which way do I go? I like it a lot better now. There's a couple of road segments that are very short, but you have to go a very particular direction. Otherwise, you'll end up in some place that you're not intending to be. So signage very much improved. Surface-wise, I would say it was largely excellent. There were a few muddy spots, but it was no big deal. I don't know what it would have been like with the rain. Actually, that's not true. It would have been bad in a couple of spots. And I don't know what it is about me and riding the Gap, but it always seems to rain when I'm about to do or I'm doing this one particular section from between Connellsville and basically the middle part of the Great Allegheny Passage. It's really kind of funny. I don't think I've ever hit it where there hasn't been a rainstorm either a day before or when I'm riding it. It's very funny. And I think that's also the area where the trail condition tends to deteriorate the most. But this was, on the day that I rode it, it was excellent. It was really nice. The section that I rode is probably where camping is the most plentiful, and that's between Connellsville and Pittsburgh. When I say camping, I really should be more specific. It's not only the amount of camping, but the amount of free camping. As you may have seen in the video, which again, I encourage you to check out, and I'll have that linked in the show notes here. You've got, Connellsville's free. You've got, you've got 4 free campgrounds between Pittsburgh and Connellsville. And now, in some ways, that's great. In some ways, that's not so helpful because that's sort of a day's ride anyways. So, it may or may not be super helpful. Depends on what the nature of your journey is and where you're going to end up. If you're going to, not be staying in Pittsburgh, maybe it's good to stay at Drobo Cemetery, hang out in Pittsburgh for a little bit and then kind of keep going to wherever your ultimate final stay is going to be. But it's great, and I really like what the local community groups and the scouts are doing with those campsites. They're excellent and a lot of fun. The Adirondack shelters are kind of the best part of the whole thing. Connellsville this time was spectacular. There was nobody else there camping. There were no issues. The amenities are amazing. I talked about it in previous editions. I've talked about it in the Gap before. There's every once in a while, especially I think during the summers, there are sometimes some dodgy things that happen there. But for the most part, I've had excellent experiences there, and this was definitely no different. I also want to give a quick shout out to Pittsburgh. Shout out to the Burg. I would say that this was my favorite trip to Pittsburgh of any of the other trips that I've ever made. I had a friend who went to the University of Pittsburgh for graduate school, so I visited her once, and so I knew a little bit about what was going on the south side of Pittsburgh. Visited there for work on a couple of occasions, but I really, really enjoyed being on the south side. For the evening that I was there. I would definitely recommend Southside Traveler's Rest if you want to stay for a night and you're intending to be on a bike tour. It's close to a ton of amenities. You've got a lot of different bars and restaurants all within walking distance. You're super close to the trail. They'll lock your bike up. Great bang for the buck, literally blocks from the trail. I thought also it would be a good idea to talk about my travel, both before and after the tour, because I think that was a big part of this tour because it was so transit-aided, which seems to be a theme for 2018, that transit-aided touring was a real piece of what I did. And the Brompton obviously is so great for all of that, but I think I've got some particular takeaways for how I got to and from the beginning and end of my tour. So let's talk about Megabus, which was the carrier that I was on from DC to Pittsburgh. It worked out just fine, but unless your bike is small, is foldable like my Brompton, or is boxed, I doubt that they would take you. But let me know, shoot me an email, pedalshift@pedalshift.net, if you've ridden Megabus and you've taken a full-size bike. Like maybe you just wrapped it up in plastic, or how it worked for you. But based on everything that I can see, based on the signage at the bus terminal and on their website, it looks like that they will not take full-size bikes. This is in contrast to Bolt Bus, which is sort of, other than Greyhound, their number one competitor. They'll at least consider taking a full-size bike. I've done it before between Portland and Seattle. In fact, I did it for my 2014 tour. Am I right on that? I think that's what I did it for. I think I've done it in other instances as well. They just kind of throw it underneath the bus and they say, hey, if it breaks, it's not on us, which is, I guess, fine. Greyhound, I know, also only takes bikes if they are boxed up. And that's a bit of a hassle on tour, but, we sort of put up with that as necessary with how we move things around. So Megabus, while I had a really good, cheap fare, you're limited in what you can ride and what you can do. If you're cool with having a boxed bike, then it could be a really great option for you. I think if I was to do a Megabus ride again, I would almost assuredly be using the Brompton, because the Brompton, while there are some things that you give up, the fact that I can just fold it up, have it in the bag, and be under the bus, no problem. The extra ticket thing worked. Overall, it cost me, I think, $16 or $17 to get from here in DC to Pittsburgh with my bike and all my gear. That's really awesome when you compare it to flying, way more expensive. The train, more expensive, and drops you off at like freaking midnight or something like that. It's just, it just was not a great deal. Megabus ended up working out really well for me. Amtrak, as it has been, this is of course for the return trip, as it has been in recent years, is a breeze with a Brompton. I don't even get looked at twice with it. It's a carry-on. That plus my duffel, it was no problem. I get on the train, I shove them on the lower level in the baggage area right there, no problem. I don't even need to load it into the baggage car like I do for the roll-on service for my full-size bike. It's even easier than that. Awesome, great. I mentioned my duffel. The one that I recommend is by a company called Stansport. I've got a link in the show notes if you want to check that one out. I've used it for all types of travel. It never gets a blink when I'm checking it in for any mode of transit, and it is straight up enormous. It's this bulletproof canvas, and it rolls up small enough to carry or layer on the bottom of the rack for the dry bags to lay on top of. If you've served in the military and you've got a duffel, or you have access to an Army-Navy surplus store, you might be able to find a good value in a duffel from that wing as well. It's become such a great utilitarian travel companion for me. I use it when I travel to other places as well, even if it has nothing to do with bike touring. But the cool part about it is that I can take my existing bags, just literally toss them in there, zip things up, and be gone. And it makes things efficient and easy and quick. And the other great part about it is I don't care if it gets wet. It's not that big of a deal because I'm not trying to keep things inside of it dry. I'm putting my dry bags and everything else inside of it after the fact. So if I'm on a tour and the thing gets soaked, no big deal. I mean, I guess it'll be a problem when I'm carrying stuff around and have a wet bag next to me. But, hey, it still will work. And I don't have to worry about keeping my bag dry at the same time. Be mindful, though, that when you're carrying all of your gear in a duffel, that it's awkward and it's heavy. I mean, it's kind of a testament to how efficient bicycles can carry the weight when it's distributed on your racks and things like that. When you kind of put it in this awkward, gigantic bag with a shoulder strap and throw it over your shoulder, and it's kind of knocking against your hip or on your back or whatever, man, it's weird and hard to carry for very long. It's sort of what I was dealing with on the way back. When I was having to, I had the handle on my bike, so I was able to carry that or push that or roll that. But I had this enormous duffel bag that was probably, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 pounds. It was just banging into my hip, and I'm trying to catch subway trains and stuff like that here in the DC area. And it was just not super great. But considering what I was doing, it was pretty good. And I would say that the duffel is a great way to kind of move things around. I prefer that, I think, as I mentioned, to the backpack when all is said and done. Although I think the backpack would have been way more comfortable for the maneuverability. So I like the speed. I like the how well it compacts down. I like a whole lot of other things, but I'm giving up maneuverability once I am maneuvering. I don't know if that makes sense. Anyways, one last bit of takeaways here, and this came via Twitter. Thank you to Stop It Bruce, and he uses 1, 2, 3 R's. Stop It Bruce. Dude, I'm barely coherent. Thank you to Stop It Bruce. First of all, Duquesne University is not in Duquesne, Pennsylvania. Apparently, Duquesne is kind of a rough town. I understand Duquesne is actually in Pittsburgh. Duquesne University, Duquesne the town, rough, does not contain Duquesne University. Second thing that I was thrown I was thrown under the bus for. No, I was criticized for, rightfully so, because I was wrong. The river I was following when I was coming out of Pittsburgh was in fact the Monongahela, or the Mon as most locals call it, not the Allegheny. I think I really knew that, but I just blew it in the moment. It was just sort of bicycle brain. But in any event, mea culpa. Thank you, Stop It Bruce, for setting me straight. So overall, it was short. It was sweet. It was a lot of fun when I was in the middle of it. I'm bummed I had to call it a little bit early, but I think I took a lot of great stuff away from it. And I'm really glad that I was able to share a lot of these takeaways with you on the show. We like to close out the show with a big thank you to all of the supporters of the Pedalshift project through the Pedalshift Society. If you like what you hear, you can help maintain Pedalshift as an independent, listener-supported voice while expanding the offerings. We're talking $5, $2, or even $1 a month helps with the cost of hosting the podcast, the website, and more. And you can do it for a little bit, cancel anytime. One-shot support's welcome if you're not into the whole small monthly thing, and you can check it all out and join at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Ethan Georgi, Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lien, Andrew MacGregor, Michael Hart, Keith Nagel, Brock Dittus, Thomas Skadow, Seth Krieger, Marco Lowe, Terrance Manson, Noah Schroer, Harry Telgadas, John Sikorski, Richard Killian, Chris Barron, Brian Hren, Mark Van Raam, Brad Hipwell, Paul Mulvey, Stuart Bucket, Todd Stutz, Mr. T, Roxy Arning, Nathan Poulton, Harry Hugel, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Ruth DeVorsey, Michelle Miller, Matthew Lewis, Michael Baker, Billy Crafton, Paul Culbertson, Scott Culbertson, Matt Perry, Danielle Jepson, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Bobby Rupel, Roy Everett, Greg Braithwaite, John Mayer, William Cairns, Sandy Pizzio, Richard Patch, Mark Messer, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Dave Roll, Joseph Quinn, John Baxter, Susan Brewster, Drew Porter, Brian Patterson, and thank you to all anonymous and past contributors for helping make this show happen. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.